I've seen a lot of things in my 53 years on this earth. Seen calves born in blizzards, seen men die from snake bite, seen drought turn green pastures to dust in a matter of weeks. But I ain't never seen nothing like what I saw that first Tuesday morning in late October. The children appeared at the gate like they'd been waiting there all night. 3 of them, small, ragged, eyes too big for their faces. They didn't knock or call out. Just stood there, holding onto the iron bars, looking toward the house like they could see right through the walls. I was mending fence along the eastern boundary when my dog, Blue, started carrying on. He ain't much of a barker usually, so when he started up, I knew something was wrong. I rode back across the north pasture, took me about 20 minutes, and when I crested the last hill, I saw them. 3 children. The oldest couldn't have been more than maybe 7 or 8. The youngest was just a toddler, clinging to the oldest's hand, swaying on her feet like she might fall over any second. They were thin. Not the kind of thin you see on city folk who skip lunch. No, this was the kind of thin that comes from weeks of empty bellies, hollow cheeks, collarbones sharp as arrowheads, eyes that had seen too much and eaten too little. I dismounted slow so as not to spook them. "Howdy there," I called out, keeping my voice soft. "You all lost?" The oldest, a boy I could see now, just stared at me. Dark hair matted to his forehead, a cut on his lip that looked a few days old. He was holding a little girl's hand and she was holding the toddler's, like a chain of bones wrapped in rags. I walked closer, and that's when I noticed their clothes. Dirty, too thin for the October chill. The boy had a jacket that was 3 sizes too big, the sleeves rolled up past his wrists. The little girl wore a dress that had once been pink but was now more brown than anything. The toddler just had a tattered sweater and no shoes. "Are you hungry?" I asked. The boy nodded, just once, slow. "I'm not what you'd call a sentimental man. Never married, no children of my own. My mother used to say I had a heart like a stone, and maybe she was right. I've lived alone on this ranch for 30 years now, and I've grown comfortable with my solitude. But something about those children sitting there at my gate, shaking in the cold, not asking for anything, just waiting to be noticed. It cracked me open in a way I couldn't explain then and still can't fully articulate now. "Come on," I said, opening the gate. "Let's get you something to eat." They followed me to the house. The boy wouldn't let go of his sister's hands. Even when I held the door open and gestured for them to enter, he held on tight. Like if he let go, they might disappear. Like he was the only thing keeping them tethered to this world. I gave them bread and honey, the last of the apples from the tree by the barn, and some cold beans left over from last night's dinner. They ate like they hadn't seen food in a week, which I later learned they hadn't. The oldest, whose name was David, told me their story in bits and pieces between bites. Their mother had died the spring before consumption, he said, though he pronounced it consumption. Their father had worked at the mining camp up in the hills but had stopped coming home about 3 weeks ago. There was no one else. No grandparents, no aunts or uncles. Just the 3 of them, living in a shack near the old logging road, trying to survive. "We used to pick berries," David said, not looking at me. "But the berries are gone now, and the rabbits are too fast." That was the first day. I fed them. I let them sleep in the spare room. I woke up in the middle of the night and checked on them 3 times just to make sure they were still breathing. They were. Curled up together on the bed like a litter of puppies, their bodies so small they barely made a lump under the quilt. In the morning I fed them again. I gave them clothes, old shirts and sweaters I'd had in storage. I thought about keeping them, taking them in. But I'm a man who lives alone, and what does a man like me know about children? I didn't even know how to talk to them, really. I just gave them food and a warm place to sleep and tried not to think too hard about the hollow look in their eyes. I drove them back to their shack that afternoon. It was an hour's drive through the hills, down a rutted road that barely qualified as a road at all. The shack was falling apart. Roof half caved in. Windows broken. No wood for the stove. It was a miracle they'd survived as long as they had. "Stay here," I said, handing David a sack of supplies. "I'll come check on you tomorrow." He nodded, but I could see in his eyes that he didn't expect me to come back. Why would he? People had probably let him down his whole life. I came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. I brought food, firewood, blankets. I fixed the roof as best I could. I taught David how to set rabbit snares, though we both knew there wasn't much to catch this time of year. And every morning, without fail, the children would be at the ranch gate. I'd wake up at dawn and they'd be there standing like three little statues, waiting. They never knocked, never called out, just waited until I came out to fetch them. I never understood why they couldn't stay at the shack, why they felt the need to make the long walk every single day. But I didn't ask. I just fed them, kept them warm, and let them sleep in the spare room where they'd curl up together like they'd always done. It went on like that for weeks. Every day the same ritual. They'd arrive at the gate, I'd bring them inside, I'd feed them, and they'd sleep. Sometimes David would talk to me while his sisters napped. He told me about their mother. Her laugh, he said, was like wind chimes. He told me about their father before the drinking started. He used to be a good man, David said. He used to tell stories. But mostly they were quiet. The little girls, Ruth and Hannah, I learned their names eventually, barely spoke at all. Ruth, the middle one, had a habit of touching everything. The walls, the dishes, my hands when I was close enough. Like she needed to prove to herself that the world was still solid. Hannah, the toddler, would just curl up in my lap and fall asleep, sometimes in the middle of eating, and I'd let her, because what else could you do? I started to get used to them, started to look forward to the sound of their footsteps on the porch, started to buy things I never used to buy: milk, eggs, sugar. I learned how to braid Ruth's hair, though I was terrible at it. I learned that Hannah liked to be held while I was working, that she'd sit on my hip and watch me chop wood or feed the cows, her little body warm against mine. I think, looking back, that part of me knew I was in trouble. Part of me knew that I'd opened a door that I couldn't close. I'm a man who spent most of his life alone, comfortable in my solitude, and these three children had tunneled their way into my heart like miners through a rock face. I didn't know how it had happened. I just knew it had. What I didn't know was that they were about to teach me something I'd never expected to learn. Something about love, something about letting go, something about following instead of being followed. The first thing I noticed was that they never knocked. I'd always been a light sleeper, but after those first few days, I started waking up before dawn, pulled from sleep by some sixth sense that told me they were there. I'd open my eyes and lie still for a moment, listening, and sure enough, I'd hear nothing but the wind and the creak of the house settling. But I'd know. I'd pull on my coat and walk to the gate, and there they'd be. David in front, back straight, trying to look tough. Ruth beside him, holding his hand. Hannah asleep against Ruth's shoulder, her little face slack with exhaustion. They looked like refugees from some distant war, which I guess they were. "Morning," David would say. He never smiled. I don't think I ever saw David smile in all the time I knew him. "Morning yourself," I'd reply. "Come on in." They'd follow me to the house, their steps quiet and careful, like they were afraid of being found out. I'd feed them breakfast, oatmeal mostly, with honey from the apiary I kept behind the barn. Sometimes eggs if the hens were laying. And then I'd take them back to their shack, or I'd let them sleep, or sometimes I'd take them with me while I worked. David liked to help with the cattle. He wasn't afraid of the bulls, even the big one with the bad eye. He'd stand his ground and wave his arms, yelling in that high, thin voice of his, and the cattle would turn. He wasn't big enough to do any real work, but he'd try. Lord, he'd try. Ruth, on the other hand, was more timid. She'd stick close to the house, or to me if I was nearby. She liked to help with the cooking, though there was barely enough for us, let alone for her to practice. She'd stand on a chair and stir the pot, her little face frowning with concentration. And Hannah. Well, Hannah was just a baby, really. Barely 3 years old, I guessed, though it was hard to tell with how small she was. She had a habit of crawling into my lap and falling asleep no matter what I was doing. Reading, mending fence, eating supper. She'd just appear, her little fingers clutching my shirt, and she'd be out before I could even say her name. The mornings were the hardest. They'd come to the gate hungry and cold, and no matter how many times I told them they could stay, they'd always go back to that shack at the end of the day. David insisted on it. "Father might come back," he said once, when I asked him why they didn't just stay with me. "And if he comes back and we're not there, he won't know where to find us." I didn't have the heart to tell him that his father wasn't coming back. I'd seen men like his father before. Men who worked in the mines, who drank away their wages, who came home bruised and mean. Sometimes they disappeared. Sometimes they got lost in the dark, as my own father used to say. When I drove the children home that first time, I saw the mine entrance about a mile from their shack. I saw the path leading up to it, and I saw the whiskey bottles scattered around the property like weeds. I knew with a certainty that settled cold in my chest that their father wasn't coming back. Not ever. But I didn't say that to David. I just nodded and let him keep his hope. It was all he had. Every day for 2 weeks, they walked 10 miles from the old logging road to my gate. Every day, I'd feed them and let them sleep. Every day, I'd drive them back in my pickup, the road kicking up dust and gravel, and I'd watch them walk into that shack, 3 tiny figures swallowed by the darkness. I started looking forward to them. I'd never admit it out loud, but it was true. I'd wake up thinking about their faces, about what I'd feed them that day, about whether David would want to help with the cattle or whether Ruth would ask me to read to her. I'd never been a man for children, never thought I had the patience for them, but these 3 had wormed their way into my world so thoroughly that I couldn't imagine it without them. And then, on the 15th day, they didn't come. I woke at dawn, earlier than usual, and I knew before I even got to the gate that they weren't there. The air felt wrong, empty. I walked to the gate and looked out, scanning the road, the hills, the flat stretches of pasture, nothing but dust and grass. I waited an hour, 2 hours. I went back to the house, made coffee, and sat on the porch, staring down the road. I tried to tell myself it was fine. Maybe they'd overslept. Maybe David had decided to let them rest. Maybe something had come up. But I knew, deep in my gut, that something was wrong. I got in the truck and drove to their shack. The road was worse than I remembered, ruts and potholes, gravel scattered like broken teeth. I had to go slow, my hands tight on the wheel, my eyes scanning for any sign of them. The shack was still standing somehow. The roof was intact thanks to my repairs. The windows were still boarded over, courtesy of the plywood I'd nailed up, but the door was open. I parked and got out. David, Ruth, Hannah. No answer, just the wind in the trees and the caw of a crow somewhere nearby. I walked to the door and pushed it open. The inside was dark and cold. The bed in the corner was empty, the blankets folded neatly. The fire in the stove was dead and cold. The small sack of supplies I'd given them was empty. And then I saw it, written in the dust on the floor, in letters made with a stick or a finger. "We had to go, I'm sorry." My heart dropped. I stood there for a long moment, staring at those words, trying to understand what they meant. Where would they go? Why hadn't they come to me? I'd told them they could stay. I'd made it clear that my home was their home. I walked the perimeter of the property, calling their names. I checked the mine entrance, though I hated every second of it. I walked the logging road for a mile in either direction. Nothing. I kept looking, the rest of the day. The next day, I scoured the hills, drove to the nearest town, asked everyone I met if they'd seen 3 children. No one had. The townsfolk looked at me like I was crazy, an old man asking about strangers' kids. On the 3rd day, I gave up. I didn't want to, but I had no choice. The search was hopeless. I told myself they'd be fine. I told myself David was resourceful. I told myself they'd probably found their way to a relative or a neighbor. I didn't believe any of it. The next week was brutal. I went through the motions, feeding cattle, mending fence, gathering eggs, but my heart wasn't in it. The house felt empty and silent in a way it never had before. I'd set 3 plates at the table, then remember there was no one to fill them. I'd walk to the gate at dawn, expecting to see them there and find nothing but dust. I stopped cooking, stopped eating mostly. I lost weight. I lost sleep. I'd lie in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering where they were, whether they were cold, whether they were hungry, whether they were even alive. And then on the 8th day, they came back. I was in the barn mucking out stalls when I heard Blue barking at the gate. I walked out, wiping my hands on my jeans, and there they were. 3 figures, smaller than I remembered, thinner, more ragged. David was carrying Hannah, whose little head lolled on his shoulder. Ruth was clinging to his sleeve, her face streaked with dirt and tears. They looked like they'd walked through hell. "David," I called out, breaking into a run. "What happened? Where did you go?" He looked up at me and I saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the fear, the hopelessness. "We tried to find him," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We walked all the way to the mine up to the top, but he wasn't there. Nobody was there. And then we got lost and we couldn't find our way back, and Hannah got sick and Ruth was crying and—" "Stop," I said, pulling them into a hug. All 3 of them all at once. I didn't care how I looked, didn't care that my shirt was getting dirty, didn't care about anything but the warmth of their bodies pressed against mine. "You're here now. You're safe. That's all that matters." They were trembling, all of them. The cold, yes, but also something else. Something deeper. Fear, maybe, or shame. They'd tried to find their father, tried to bring him back, and they'd failed. They'd come back to me with empty hands and broken hearts. I carried them inside, built up the fire, made them hot soup and warm bread. They ate in silence, not looking at me, not looking at each other. When they were done, I put them to bed in the spare room, tucked them in with the quilt my mother had made, and sat in the doorway, watching them sleep. Hannah was burning up, I realized. Her forehead was hot to the touch, and she was breathing fast and shallow. Ruth had a cough that rattled in her chest, and David was shivering despite the warmth of the fire. I stayed up all night, checking on them, wiping their foreheads with a damp cloth, trying to get them to drink water. They all tossed and turned, tormented by fever dreams and nightmares. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up to the sound of David crying. Quiet, choked sobs that he was trying to muffle with the blanket. I went to him, sat on the edge of the bed, and put my hand on his shoulder. "Hey there," I said softly. "It's all right, you're safe now." "I couldn't find him," he said, his voice cracking. "I tried, I really tried, but I couldn't find him, and Hannah got sick and I didn't know what to do. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." I didn't know what to say. What could I say? That it wasn't his fault, that his father had probably been gone for weeks, maybe months, that the search had been hopeless from the start. I pulled him into a hug, and he clung to me like I was a lifeline. His little body shook with sobs, and I held him, rocked him, told him it was going to be okay. "I'm not leaving again," I said. "I promise. You're staying here with me, and I'm going to take care of you, all of you." He cried for a long time after that, and I held him the whole time. When he finally fell asleep, I tucked him in and checked on the girls. Ruth was still coughing in her sleep, and Hannah's fever was spiking again. I made a decision then, a decision that would change everything. It wasn't just about the children anymore. It was about David's father and what had happened to him. It was about the mine and the darkness that lived there. It was about the mystery that had been gnawing at me since the children first appeared at my gate. I had to know where he'd gone. I had to know why he'd left. And I couldn't shake the feeling that the answer was waiting for me up at that mine. The mine sat at the top of the hill, like a wound in the earth's skin. I'd driven past it 100 times over the years, always giving it a wide berth. Mines had a way of swallowing men, body and soul, and I'd never had any desire to be swallowed. But now, standing at the entrance with the cold wind biting at my face, I felt something pull me forward. It was a feeling like I'd never had before. Not quite curiosity, not quite obligation. More like a thread had been tied around my chest and was tugging me toward that dark opening. I couldn't explain it. I didn't even try. I just followed it. I'd left the children with old Mrs. Patterson from the neighboring ranch. She was a widow in her 70s, had raised 5 children of her own, and had told me she'd be happy to take them for a few days. I didn't tell her what I was doing, didn't tell her where I was going. I just said I had business in town. The mine had been shut down for years, ever since the strike in '42. The rail tracks were rusted and overgrown, the wooden supports sagging and warped. The entrance was boarded up, but someone had pried the boards loose recently by the looks of the splintered wood. I squeezed through the gap and stepped inside. The air was cold and damp, heavy with the smell of rust and something else. Something metallic, something that made my skin prickle. I pulled out my flashlight and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a tunnel that stretched deeper than I could see. The walls were slick with moisture, black and shiny like obsidian. I could hear water dripping somewhere, a slow, steady rhythm that echoed off the stone. I started walking, slowly, carefully. Every step I took echoed in the silence, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something old and patient, waiting in the dark. The tunnel sloped downward, the floor littered with rocks and debris. I had to watch my footing, had to keep my hand on the wall to steady myself. The air grew colder the deeper I went, and I pulled my coat tighter around my body. I don't know how long I walked. Minutes, maybe. Hours. Time had a way of stretching down here, of warping and twisting until you couldn't tell what was real and what was just your mind playing tricks. And then I saw it. A light up ahead, faint flickering like a candle. I should have been relieved. I wasn't. The light felt wrong somehow, too small, too unstable, like it was trying to lure me in. But I kept walking. The tunnel opened up into a chamber, maybe 20 feet across. The walls were covered in graffiti, names and dates scratched into the stone. Bottles littered the ground. Whiskey, mostly, but also jars and cans and other things I didn't want to identify. And in the center of the chamber, there was a man. He was sitting on the floor, hunched over, his back against a support beam. His clothes were torn and dirty, his hair matted and unkempt. He had a flask in his hand, and when I stepped into the light, he looked up. I knew him immediately. I'd seen his face in the photographs David had shown me, the ones he kept folded in his pocket like a talisman. The same sunken eyes, the same hollow cheeks, the same desperate, broken look. "James," I said, my voice echoing in the chamber. "James Galloway." He blinked at me, slow and uncomprehending. "Who's askin'?" His voice was hoarse, like he hadn't spoken in days. "I'm the man who's been looking after your children," I said. I kept my voice calm, even though I wanted to shake him. "David, Ruth, Hannah, your children." Something flickered in his eyes, recognition, then shame. He looked away, his shoulders hunching even further. "Shouldn't have come here," he muttered. "Shouldn't have followed me." "I didn't follow you," I said. "I followed them. They were looking for you, James. They walked all the way to the mine to find you, and you weren't here." He flinched at that, his hands tightening around the flask. "I told them not to come," he said. "I told them to stay away from this place." "You haven't been home in weeks," I said. "They came to the mine. They got lost. They almost died. And now Hannah is sick with a fever and Ruth has a cough that won't stop, and David—" I stopped. I didn't need to go on. He knew. I could see it in his face. He knew what he'd done or what he'd failed to do. "I tried," he said, his voice cracking. "I really tried. After Sarah died, I tried to hold it together for them, but I couldn't. Every time I looked at them, I saw her. Their eyes, their smiles, and I couldn't bear it. I didn't say anything. What was there to say? I came here because I thought I could work," he continued. "Thought I could find something in the old tunnels, something to sell. But there's nothing here, nothing but darkness and memories, and I kept drinking, kept trying to forget, and then I couldn't remember how to leave. He looked at me then, and I saw something I hadn't expected to see: desperation, and underneath that something else, something that looked a lot like relief. "Are they okay?" he asked. "My children, are they safe?" "They're with a friend," I said. "They're warm, they're fed, but they need you, James, they need their father." He shook his head slowly. "I'm not the man they need," he said. "I'm not the man their mother thought I was. I'm a failure, a drunk. I can't give them anything, not anymore." "You can give them yourself," I said. "That's all they ever wanted." He stared at me for a long time, his eyes glassy with tears. Then he laughed, a short, bitter laugh that echoed off the walls. "You don't understand," he said. "You don't know what it's like to lose someone like that, to wake up every day knowing they're gone and there's nothing you can do about it." I knelt down in front of him, close enough to see the stubble on his chin, the broken blood vessels in his eyes. "I know what it's like," I said. "I lost my father to a mine collapse when I was 16. My mother never recovered. She died of a broken heart, or so they say. And I spent the next 30 years alone because I was too afraid to let anyone close. I know what it's like to feel like you can't go on. I know what it's like to wake up every morning and wish you hadn't." He looked at me, really looked at me, and I could see the walls starting to crack. "Your children came to my gate every day for weeks," I said. "They walked 10 miles, James, through the cold and the wind and the dark just to get a warm meal and a place to sleep. And they kept coming even when it hurt, even when they were tired and hungry and scared, because they had hope. They had hope that you'd come back, that you'd find them, that you'd be their father again." His hand was shaking. The flask in his grip trembled, and I could see the liquid inside sloshing from side to side. "If I go back with you," he said slowly, "if I leave this place, what then? I don't know how to be a father. I don't know how to be anything." "You learn," I said. "You make mistakes, you try again. You show up every day even when you don't want to. That's what being a parent is. It's showing up." The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. I could hear the water dripping, could feel the cold seeping through my coat. I waited, not pushing, not asking, just waiting. And then slowly, James pushed himself to his feet. "I don't have anything to give them," he said. "No money, no food, no home." "You have yourself," I repeated, "and that's enough." He nodded once, and I could see the resolve settling into his features. It was fragile, I knew, breakable, but it was there. We walked out together, James stumbling a little as we went. He was weak from hunger and drink, and I had to support him through the narrow tunnels. When we emerged into the daylight, he shielded his eyes and let out a breath that was almost a sob. I drove him back to my ranch, where Mrs. Patterson was sitting on the porch with the children. David saw his father first. His face went pale, and then it crumpled, and he ran across the yard, his arms outstretched. "Pa," he cried, and the sound of his voice broke something inside me. James fell to his knees, wrapping his arms around David, holding him like he was the most precious thing in the world. Ruth came running next, and then Hannah toddled over, and they all fell to the ground in a heap of tears and laughter. I stood there, watching them, and I felt a warmth spread through my chest. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if James would stay sober, or if he'd be able to care for his children, or if any of this would last. But I knew one thing for sure. That was the moment I decided to follow them all the way home. The first thing I did was move James and his children into the spare rooms at the back of my house. They needed rest, they needed food, and they needed time to find their footing. James was sober for the first time in weeks, and I could see the struggle in his eyes. Every muscle in his body seemed to shake with the effort of staying present, of not slipping back into the bottle. But he stayed. For the first few days he barely ate. He sat at the table, staring at the wall, his hands folded in front of him. He was a ghost, hollowed out and barely visible. The children watched him like he was a wounded animal, afraid to come too close. "Why don't you talk to him?" I asked David one evening when James had gone out to the porch to sit alone. "He's your father, he needs you." David looked at me with those old eyes of his. What do I say? He left us. He chose the whiskey over us. I knelt down in front of him, my knees popping. "Your father is a broken man," I said. "He's been carrying a weight for a long time. He made a mistake, a terrible one, but he's here now. He's trying. And if you want to help him, you can't just stand by and wait. You have to reach out to him. Show him that you still care." David didn't answer. He just looked at me with that same hollow gaze. The next morning, I found David sitting on the porch next to his father. They weren't talking, just sitting side by side, staring out at the pasture. But there was something in the way James's hand rested on his son's shoulder, something tentative, something that made my heart ache. I started noticing little things after that, small gestures that told a larger story. Ruth would bring her father a cup of coffee without being asked. Hannah would crawl into his lap and he'd hold her, his hands shaking but steady enough. And David would sit with him, silent but present. It was a process, a slow, painful process. Some days James would be better, and some days he would relapse. He'd disappear into the barn for hours, and I'd find him there, hunched over, his eyes red and swollen. I'd sit with him, not saying anything, just waiting. "Tell me about the children," I'd say sometimes. "Tell me about their mother." And he'd talk. About Sarah with her wind chime laugh. About the day David was born and how he'd been so scared of dropping him. About Ruth, who had her mother's eyes. About Hannah, who was the spitting image of her mother. "The hardest part," he told me once, his voice barely a whisper, "was seeing her face in theirs. Every time they smiled, every time they laughed, it was like she was there. And it hurt. It hurt so much I couldn't breathe." I listened. I didn't judge. I just listened. The children settled into a routine. David started helping me with the cattle, his confidence growing a little more each day. Ruth took over the cooking, learning to make bread and stew with a skill that surprised me. And Hannah, well, Hannah just stayed Hannah, sweet and stubborn and full of a joy that seemed to defy everything she'd been through. I started to realize that I'd found something I never expected. A family. A makeshift, broken, imperfect family, but a family nonetheless. And then James made a decision that would change everything again. "I need to go back," he said one night as we were sitting by the fire. "Back to the house, back to where we lived." I stared at him. "James, that house is falling apart. It's not safe. And the mine." "I know," he said, "but I can't keep hiding. I can't keep letting you take care of us. I need to stand on my own 2 feet. I need to prove to my children that I'm worth fighting for." I wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he could stay, that I didn't mind, that I'd help him for as long as he needed. But I looked at him, at the resolution in his eyes, and I knew it wasn't my place to decide. It was his. "Okay," I said, "we'll fix up the house together." And so we did. For the next few weeks, we drove out to that shack at the edge of the logging road every day, and we rebuilt it. We fixed the roof, replaced the windows, insulated the walls. We built a new kitchen with a stove that worked. We fixed the plumbing, brought in water from the well. We even built new beds, ones big enough for everyone. The children helped. David was the strongest, carrying wood and nails and whatever else we needed. Ruth was in charge of cleaning, scrubbing the floors and the walls until they sparkled. Hannah mostly got in the way, but her laughter made the work easier. And James worked alongside me day after day. He learned how to hammer, how to saw, how to measure and cut and build. He was clumsy at first, but he got better. And every day his shoulders seemed to straighten, his eyes a little clearer. The day we finished, we all stood in the yard looking at the house. It wasn't big, wasn't fancy, but it was sound. It was solid. It was a home. "Thank you," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything. I don't know how to repay you." "You don't have to," I said. "Just take care of your children, that's enough." The children were overjoyed. David ran through the house, testing the floors. Ruth arranged the new furniture that Mrs. Patterson had donated. Hannah danced in the front yard, her arms spread wide like she was flying. And that night James walked home with them, the first night in months that he'd been sober and clear-headed and present. I watched him go, his hand on David's shoulder, Ruth's hand in his, Hannah on his hip. He turned at the end of the road, and he waved. I waved back. And then I went home to my empty house, and I didn't sleep a wink. The days turned into weeks, and James did something I had never expected. He stayed sober. He worked. He took care of his children. And when the logging company announced that they were looking for workers, he applied. "I've got experience," he said when I asked about it. "I used to work in the mines. I know how to use my hands." "I thought you hated the mines," I said. "I do," he said, "but I hate being poor even more, and I hate not being able to provide for my children." He got the job. It was hard work and it didn't pay much, but it was honest work. He'd come home at the end of the day, his body aching, his face dirty, and he'd play with the children until they fell asleep. I started to see a different side of him, a side that had been buried under years of grief and guilt. He started to laugh again, started to tell stories, started to be the man he'd always wanted to be. And the children in turn started to heal. David smiled for the first time in months. Ruth stopped coughing and grew stronger. And Hannah, well, Hannah was the same. She was always the strong one, I realized. She was the one who held it all together. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, something I couldn't quite name, something about James, about the children, about me. And then I realized what it was. The children had stopped coming to the gate. I'd gotten so used to seeing them every morning that I'd started taking it for granted. But now that James was working, now that they had their own home, they didn't need to make the long walk anymore. I missed them. I missed the sound of their footsteps on the porch, the sight of their faces at the gate. I missed feeding them breakfast, watching them sleep, holding Hannah in my lap. I was a lonely old man, I realized, and I'd gotten used to having them around. I didn't tell James. I didn't tell anyone. I just went about my work, feeding cattle and mending fence, and tried to ignore the emptiness in my chest. But then, one morning, I heard a knock at the door. I opened it, and there they were, David, Ruth, and Hannah, all three of them standing on the porch, their faces bright with excitement. "Good morning," David said. "We came to help," Ruth added. Hannah just smiled up at me, her little mouth full of missing teeth. "Help with what?" I asked, my voice cracking with an emotion I didn't want to name. "With chores," David said. "Pa said we should come and thank you for everything, and what better way to thank you than by working?" I laughed a real laugh one I hadn't made in a long time. "All right," I said, "let's get to work." That day we did all the chores together. David helped with the cattle. Ruth helped with the cooking. Hannah collected eggs from the coop, carefully placing each one in the basket with a reverence that made my heart swell. And when James came to pick them up at the end of the day, he saw me, and I saw him, and we both knew. "I can't do this on my own," he said, his voice low. "I need help. I need someone who can watch them when I'm working, someone who can be there for them. I need you." I looked at him, this broken man who had clawed his way back from the brink, and I looked at his children, who had walked 10 miles every day to find a warm meal and a kind word. "What are you saying, James?" I asked. He took a breath. "I'm saying," he said, "that maybe you could be part of our family. I'm saying that maybe you could be the grandfather they never had." I stood there in the doorway of my ranch, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. I hadn't cried in 30 years, and I wasn't about to start now. But I felt the warmth spreading through my chest, and I felt the walls around my heart start to crumble. "All right," I said. "All right, James, I'd like that." The years passed as they always do. James stayed sober, kept his job, watched his children grow. David became a young man, tall and strong, with his mother's wind chime laugh and his father's stubbornness. Ruth turned into a young woman, graceful and fierce, with a love for cooking that rivaled any chef in the county. And Hannah, well, Hannah was still Hannah, stubborn and sweet and full of mischief. And me, I got old. My knees started going bad, my hands started to shake, my hair turned from gray to white. But I didn't mind. Not with the children around, the grandchildren of my heart, filling my days with laughter and purpose. David and Ruth would come to the ranch every day, to help with chores and sit on the porch with me, drinking coffee and watching the sun set over the pasture. Hannah would curl up in my lap, just like she used to, her head against my chest, her hair smelling like hay and sunshine. "You're the only father I've ever really known," she said to me once, when she was about 14. "Pa's great and all, but you were the one who was there. You were the one who fed us when we had nothing, who kept us warm when we were cold, who showed us that there was still hope in the world." I held her tighter, not trusting myself to speak. But then one evening I heard them talking in the kitchen. James and the children, their voices low and urgent. "We have to do it," David was saying. "It's what he'd want." James sighed. "I know, but how do we tell him?" "I'll tell him," Ruth said. "He deserves to know." I walked into the kitchen, my heart pounding. "Tell me what?" They all turned to look at me. James's face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed. David was staring at the floor. Ruth was crying. "What is it?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What's wrong?" Ruth stepped forward and took my hands. "It's about Pa," she said. "James, we think he's not going to make it much longer." I felt the words hit me like a physical blow. "What are you talking about? He's fine, he's healthy, he's—" "The fever," David said, his voice breaking. "It's been going on for weeks. The doctor says it's something in his lungs. The years in the mine," he said, "the dust and the damp." I staggered backward, my hand reaching for the wall to steady myself. "Why didn't you tell me?" "We didn't want you to worry," James said, stepping forward. "You've done so much for us. We didn't want to burden you." "Burden me," I heard myself say, my voice rising. "You've never been a burden, you've been everything." That night I sat by James's bedside, holding his hand. His breathing was labored, his skin hot to the touch. I thought about all the years we'd spent together, all the meals we'd shared, all the sunsets we'd watched. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "for everything, for not being there when they needed me, for not being the father they deserved." "Stop," I said. "You've made up for it 1,000 times over." He squeezed my hand. "Will you take care of them when I'm gone?" "They're my family," I said. "I'll take care of them until my last breath." "Thank you," he said. "I could always count on you, just like Sarah could count on me when we were young. We didn't have much, but we had love, and that was enough." And then he closed his eyes, and I felt his hand go slack in mine. He was gone. The days that followed were a blur of planning and grief, the sheer shock of losing a man I had come to regard as a brother. David, Ruth, and Hannah held the ceremony together as a testament to their strength and love. They told stories of their father, the good ones, the ones that mattered, and we all shared our memories. "I think I was just afraid for so long," I told them as we stood by the grave. "Afraid of letting people in, afraid of caring too much. But you all showed me that it's worth the risk, that love is worth the pain." David put his hand on my shoulder. "You're not alone, old man, you've got us." Ruth hugged me, her arms wrapping around my frail body like a cocoon. "You'll always be part of our family," she said. And Hannah, who was now a young woman with a family of her own, smiled at me. "Stay with us," she said. "We'll take care of you just like you took care of us." So I did. I spent the next 5 years with them, watching David become a father himself, watching Ruth's cooking business grow, watching Hannah's children play in the yard where she and her siblings had once played. And when my time came, when I was old and tired, when the pain in my chest wouldn't let me sleep, I gathered them all around me. "I don't have much to give you," I said, "but I want you to know something. I never expected to find a family. I thought I'd spend my last days alone, surrounded by nothing but memories. But you all showed me that love is always there, waiting. You just have to open the door." They wept around my bed, David's shoulders shaking, Ruth sobbing into her hands, Hannah holding me like I was something precious. I thought about the first time I saw them at the gate. 3 children, starving and scared, barely hanging on. And I thought about all the years we'd spent together, all the moments we'd shared. The meals, the chores, the laughter, the tears. "I'm ready," I said. "Don't cry for me. Just remember the gate. Remember how we all came together, broken and lost, and found something worth living for." And as I closed my eyes, I saw them one last time, standing at the gate of my ranch, holding hands, waiting for me to open the door. I smiled, and I let go. David stands at the gate of the old ranch, his hand resting on the iron bars. The property has been sold, the cattle auctioned off, the house empty and silent. But the gate is still there. He looks at it, remembers the nights he and his sisters stood here, shivering in the cold, waiting for the old man to open the door. Remembers the warmth of the kitchen, the taste of fresh bread and honey. And he smiles, because even though the gate is empty now, it's not really empty. It's a memory, a connection, a thread that ties them all together. He walks back to the car where his sisters are waiting. They're both smiling, their eyes bright with tears. "Ready?" Ruth asks. He nods, ready. They drive back to the shack on the logging road, the shack they rebuilt, the shack that became a home. There's a new generation there now, David's children playing in the yard, laughing like they don't have a care in the world. And when they pull up, Hannah's youngest runs to the gate, his face alight with excitement. "Grandpa," he shouts, "you're back." David kneels down and hugs him, his arms wrapped around the little boy, his heart full to bursting. "Always," he says, "I'm always here." And somewhere in the distance, an old man smiles from the edge of the pasture, watching the family he helped build, watching the love he helped create. The gate is empty, but the door is always open.